What if I told you that 90% of the genealogical brick walls that I see aren't actually brick walls at all? They're paper walls that we've accidentally built ourselves. And I think I can prove that to you in the next hour or so. Let me start by sharing a story. I go to a lot of genealogy conferences and events every year. And one year I was at a genealogy conference, and this woman came up to me very, very, very frustrated and kind of desperate. And she just said, I have been working on this brick wall for 30 years, and my mom has worked on it, and we just can't seem to find when her grandfather immigrated into this country. We just can't find that information. And she said, can you help me? Now, love that she came asking for help. Love that she had a very specific question. What year did Grandpa immigrate? Those are really important keys. But then what happened next made me realize that those might not always be enough. I said to her in response, I said, have you found him in the US Census records after he immigrated? And she kind of looked at me quizzically and she said, well, yes. And I said, that's great. Can we take a look at those? And she said, I'm not looking for him in the census. I know where he was living after he immigrated. I'm looking for his year of immigration. And I said, I understand that. Can we look at the census records? And she got all huffy with me. She's like, we have everything in the US. We don't need his US records. We need to find when he immigrated so that we can find out exactly where he was from and who he may have immigrated with. Okay, can we take a look at the census records? Now, in that moment, I realized that there are a couple of things that are also important for us in order to be able to break through those genealogy brick walls. It's not enough that we have a really specific question that we're trying to answer. It's not enough that we are willing to come and get help wherever we can get help. We also have to be willing to accept the help that's offered. We also have to recognize that maybe if we're stuck, we don't know everything there is to know. And maybe the way through a brick wall is around it in some other fashion. Finally, she agreed, luckily. I've had people who haven't agreed. They've huffed off. And I thought, well, there goes another 30 years looking for Grandpa. But she agreed. We sat down with the census records that she had already collected. And one of the things that she did not realize, because we don't know what we don't know, one of the things she did not realize was that those census records all list the year of immigration. So 1900, 1910, they have the year of immigration and they have the naturalization status on those records. Now, in a few weeks, we're going to be talking specifically about naturalization and immigration here on our Wednesday virtual event series. So I don't want to go too deep into how we solved that particular brick wall. What I hope you got from that story is be willing to ask for help, come with a specific research question, recognize that you don't know what you don't know, and when help is offered to you, be willing to kind of lean into that experience. That particular woman walked away from me with tears in her eyes because I was able to solve her 30-year brick wall in about 10 minutes. Now, I'm not promising we're going to solve your 30-year brick walls in 10 minutes today. But here's what I am going to promise, that you're going to walk away from this hour together with some very specific strategies that you can apply to that brick wall. And what I suspect a lot of you will discover is that that brick wall is actually paper, and it was just a facade of your own making that you can bust right through. So here's what I would like to hear from you in the chat. So not in the Q&A, in the chat, or if you're watching this on YouTube, leave a comment. What I would like to hear from you is if you can articulate what your very specific brick wall question is. Some colleagues and I a few years ago developed this research methodology called the search party method. And it's a series of 5 steps that help you break through genealogy brick walls. And step number 1 is what we call spotlight. Can you articulate your research question very exactly and succinctly? Let me give you a couple of examples. A not great research question is, I don't know anything about my great grandpa and I'm looking for everything about him. Not great, right? Diffused attention gets diffused results. If you are trying to break through a brick wall, one of the best things that you can do is to just hit the same point over and over and over and over until that part of the wall weakens, and then eventually the whole wall crumbles down. But when you kind of hit all over the wall in different spots at different times with different intensity, that wall's not going anywhere. So a very specific, or what we call spotlight question, might be something like, I am looking for the father of my great-grandfather, George Williams, born in 1891 in Kansas. That's really specific. And it means you can focus all your energy and attention on answering that question, and then the brick wall can come tumbling down. So whether you put it in the chat, which I would love to hear if you can do that, or whether you write it down on a piece of paper just to get in the practice of writing down what your research or spotlight question is. Can you be that specific about what it is that you're looking for? Because the more specific, the more terrific. Remember that, okay? The more specific, the more terrific. If you can articulate an exact, specific question, then it opens up a whole world of possibilities of things that you can go out and start to look for. But if you're just looking for everything, that diffused attention means that brick wall is not going anywhere. Kind of have that imagery in your head? Does that work for you? Okay, so I am going to share my screen. I have prepared a few things for you today as far as notes, because I want to just, make sure that I don't miss anything when I'm talking to you about some of these methodologies for breaking through these brick walls. Also, I know some of you have requested some more visuals so that you can kind of keep track of the things that we're talking about and make sure that you're not missing anything along the way. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And while I am doing that, hopefully we'll all be seeing the same thing. There we go. Okay, let me share my screen. We're going to share the PowerPoint presentation. And that should be what you all are seeing now. Yes, yes, fantastic. Okay, here we go. So I did mention this, right? 90% of your genealogy brick walls aren't actually brick walls. They're paper walls we've built ourselves. And so when you know what you're looking for, then the next step is to determine what it is that is going to help you figure out whether that brick wall is really solid brick or whether it's just painted paper. So here are a few things that commonly cause our brick walls. And I want you to think about the very specific research question you just wrote down and see if you haven't been guilty of some of these things. I know I certainly am. One thing that often happens is we skip around generations in our family tree. So here's what that looks like. We started our family tree by entering ourselves and our parents and our grandparents, and then maybe we knew some things about our great-grandparents, or we had some names or information from our family members, and so we put that in. And then we saw Ancestry had a potential ancestor hint or a leaf, and we chased that back a couple generations and added some more people to our tree, and then we get stuck. And we get stuck, and we think we're stuck because Ancestry is not delivering up any more potential ancestor hints or any more record leaf hints on a person. Are you really stuck? Chances are, if you climbed back down the family tree and really started to make sure you had built your tree on a solid foundation of accurate information, you might be able to keep going a little further than you were before. So that concept of slowing down and making sure you've got complete information and accurate information about an entire generation before you move on to the next generation is going to enable you to make sure that you're chasing the right people and that you're not creating your own brick walls. So don't just skip over generations quickly. Invest some time in learning about those people. Another common cause of brick walls is what I call the single source assumptions. You found one other person's family tree, or maybe 10 family trees, but they all copied it from one single source. Or you found one record that listed her maiden name, and you decided that must be the truth. The reality is that all records have errors. Let me repeat that because I think some of you, that might be brand new information to you. All records have errors. It doesn't matter if it's a census record or a birth, marriage, or death record, some official government document, there are still going to be errors in those records. Let me give you a couple of examples of how some errors creep into those records. So one of the things that I like to share is information about how census records are taken. And this is true here in the US and in Canada and in the UK. Anywhere that takes a census, for most of the history of census taking, it has been done by someone we call an enumerator. They're a person who goes door to door with the big census ledger and they fill out the information. Now, in more recent decades, the census has been taken by us personally filling out those forms, but even those can contain errors. But you've got a government person standing on your doorstep asking you personal questions about your family. And some people provided as accurate of information as they could, but maybe they had a German accent and the census taker didn't quite understand them, but they didn't want to belabor the point, and so they just filled out what they thought they heard. Maybe Dad was out in the fields working and mom was down doing the washing, and the 13-year-old daughter was home watching the younger children, and the government man showed up on the front porch, and she didn't want to take the time or get in trouble for getting the family Bible down off the bookshelf to open it up and make sure she gave all the exact accurate Christian names and ages and birthplaces of everybody in the family. So she just told him how old she thought mom and dad were and where she thought they were born. Or maybe he asked her where her parents were from, and she told them where they were from, but not where they were actually born, because he didn't ask that question. So when you start to think about how records are created, you realize how those errors creep in. And so just because you find one record that says something doesn't mean that that is all of the truth. Now, I mentioned census records, but of course we know birth, marriage, and death records can also contain errors. One of my most amusing circumstances is when a death certificate lists the parents of the informant, not the parents of the deceased. Because when the informant in their grief is answering the questions about their spouse or their mother-in-law that just died, and they say, you know, who are the parents? And they just give the names of their parents. Like that happens. So, or they didn't know the parents of the deceased. And so they just leave it blank or they guess, right? So lots of ways that different records can be wrong. Now, does that mean we can't find the truth? Absolutely not. We can find the truth, but it requires more than a single source. And let me just remind you what a single source looks like. If 10 family trees say the same thing, they could all still be a single source if they all copied it from the first guy, and the first guy got it from one record. Another way single sources look, just because you have a tombstone and a death certificate and an obituary that all list the same birth date, that could still all be a single source because the informant on the death certificate gave the birth date, and then that death certificate was used to create the tombstone, and that same informant who created the death certificate information also wrote the obituary. You don't have three different sources. You have one source, the informant who provided that information. So just start thinking about, have I created my own brick walls because of single source assumptions. That's a really important concept, especially if you're new to this, to start to wrap your brain around. Okay, another common cause for our genealogy brick walls is wrong research questions. Now, here's what I mean by that. I mentioned that you need to get really specific in your research questions and not be broad, not diffuse your attention if you actually want to break through that brick wall. But sometimes we're asking the entirely wrong question. Instead of asking, what was my grandmother's maiden name? Maybe I just need to pivot that question a little bit and figure out who were all of my grandmother's children. Because the way I'm going to find her maiden name is not by asking what was her maiden name, it's by looking for other records that might have that information. So sometimes just pivoting the question or pivoting the way you ask the question will help you break through that brick wall a lot faster. And then this relates to that last one, which is another common cause of brick walls, or what I call overlooked family members. When I was a kid, my dad set me up with a brand new computer and the first DOS-based genealogy software program. And he took the family genealogy that he'd been carting around, with him in a box from, move to move as we were growing up. And he put it on the desk next to me. And he said, okay, now that you know how to use this computer, I need to take all this information and put it in there. And so that's what I did for years. Sunday evenings, I'd sit down at the computer. My dad would sit at his computer next to me, and I would do the data entry of these old family group sheets and pedigree charts and family records that different members of the family had researched and collected over the years. Well, my mom's family, like all Southern, right? Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, big, huge families, tons of cousins, lots of information. And I would flip-flop back and forth between my dad's family and my mom's family. My dad's family, it just felt like they were really small. Like there was only a few children, like my grandpa only had two sisters. His dad only had one brother. But then as I kept going back further in the family tree, it felt like there was just one child in every family. And at one point, I turned to my dad and I said, Dad, you come from a lot of one-child families. That's really weird. And he kind of chuckled and he said, I don't actually. And I said, no, you do, look. And he said, no, think about that, Crista. Well, I realized, and after discussion with him, that his aunt, who had done a lot of that family history, had only ever been looking for the parents and the parents and the parents. And when she would hit a brick wall and couldn't find the next generation of parents, she would just like draw a line on that like it was an actual brick wall on a piece of paper. She would just cut it off and just say, okay, we can't go any further on this line. There's nothing else to find. But she had created her own brick walls because instead of identifying all of the children in a family, she only cared about the one that was her ancestor. And the reality is, all of the family tells the family history story, but also all of the family gives you a better chance of finding the next generation of information. One of the examples that I often use when talking about this is my own mother's grandfather. He died before she was born, so she never knew him. And he had married his third or fourth wife and gone off to California from Arkansas and died out in California. And he had been not a kind man. And so my grandpa, my mom's dad, didn't talk a lot about him. So when my mom got into family history, she went looking for him and she didn't know who his parents were. And she ordered a copy of his death certificate, and the death certificate, filled out by wife number 4 out in California, said that the parents' names were don't know and don't know. And so my mom thought she was stuck for a really long time. Eventually, she found a census record that had a little boy with the same name and the same time and the same place. And she just assumed that that might be him. And so she kind of penciled it into a pedigree chart and then went on her way. cousins picked that up and took it and did a bunch of research. Turns out ultimately it was wrong. But when I came back to that years later, one of the ways that I finally solved it was in looking at those census records. I discovered that in one census, when he was a newly married man, one of his brothers was living in the household with them. And so I chased down that brother, and that brother led me to two other siblings, and those siblings led me to more information. And ultimately, by putting together all of the siblings, I was able to find death certificates for them that listed their parents' names. And then that ultimately led me to a county history for Fulton County, Indiana, where a young man talked about how Uncle John and Aunt Libby left for Arkansas with a wagon train. And so now I had a little bit of the story, but it was because I was able to piece together the whole family. And so when we just trace the parents and the parents and the parents, we very often, like my Aunt Madeline, create our own brick walls by ignoring those overlooked family members, siblings, aunts and uncles, even people who marry into the family. Okay, so there are, if you want to solve your brick wall, 4 questions you have to ask yourself. So I want you to look again at the question that you're asking. Maybe your research question is, what year did my great-grandfather immigrate? Maybe your research question is, what is my great-grandmother's maiden name? Maybe your research question is, who is the father of this particular person in my family tree? Whatever your question is, there are then some follow-up questions you need to ask yourself in order to do this. Now, yesterday on the Ancestry Facebook page, we posted a question asking you for your brick walls. And I spent about 2.5 hours yesterday afternoon reading through those and responding to them. And these are the 4 questions that I asked in almost every instance. If you go back and read through that, you'll see that this is the information that you need in order to continue to move forward to solve this. Ready? You ready to write? Here's question number 1. What do I already know? So a lot of people will say, oh, well, I'm looking for this. And they'll put those questions out on Facebook or in other Ancestry communities, here in YouTube, in the comments, here in the chat, on our virtual events. And yet when you ask them, what do you already know? They don't want to back up and answer that question, or they don't really know as much as they think they know. You might. So if you're looking for what is great-grandma's maiden name, tell me everything you already know about great-grandma. Can you write it down? Do you know who she married? Do you know who all her children were? Do you know where she was living, when she died, where she died? What do you already know about her? That's the first thing. And sometimes it's just a brain dump of information. Sometimes what you have to do is you actually have to go back, and this is step 2 of the search party method, gather all the clues you already have. Like that woman looking for her immigrant great-grandfather, tell me what you already know about him. Do you have those censuses? Sometimes the answer we're looking for is already in the records that we have. We just haven't looked at them closely enough. We haven't mined all the information out of them. I talk about squeezing all the juicy goodness out of every record we find. And that's okay, because when you're first getting started, you don't know what you don't know. And so now, a year, 10 years, 20 years later, go back to those records. Now that you've gained new skills and new insights, now that you've shown up here and gained new information and education and skills, re-look at those records that you already have with fresh eyes, because there might be information in there that you have access to already. So what do you already know? And then question 2 goes along with it, which is, how do you know that? Now, this is the question that when I ask people, somehow some of us get really defensive. Like we don't want to answer that question sometimes, or we think somebody's questioning us. I am questioning you because I want you to question yourself. I want you to be asking, wait, how do I know this? Did I just copy this from some family group sheet that Aunt Madeline gave me? And how did she know it? Where did she get this information from? Did she just overhear it in a conversation when she was 13 years old and listening to her mom talk? And now 30 years later, she's written it down with the memory of a 13-year-old? There might be some nuggets of truth in there, but maybe it's not entirely accurate. How do you know this information? Was it a single source assumption? Do I just have one record? Did I just copy it from someone else's tree? So that is an important question to ask. So you've brain dumped all of the things you know. Now go through, and for each one of those pieces of information, how do you know it? So let's go back to great grandma and her maiden name. My research question is, I'm looking for great grandma's maiden name. Awesome. What do you know about great grandma? I know she was married, and she was married in 1892 in Arkansas. I know what county she was married in. I know who she married. I know who all of her children are. I have her in the 1900 census as a mother with some of her children. It lists her birthplace and her parents' birthplaces. I have her in the 1910 census and the 1920 census. I have her in a death record in 1929. Right? Like you start to list all the things you know about her. Then I want you to go through every one of those things and make a note of how you know it. Remember our brick wall. We are going to focus all of our energy on hitting that point over and over and over again so that that brick wall can come crumbling down. We're not going to be all over the place. So that focused attention is going to help you get through this. And so it might feel a little bit tedious to go through an exercise like this, but how badly do you want the information on the other side of that brick wall? So how do you know it? And don't get defensive when people ask you that question if you ask for help, because that's going to help us evaluate how much information you have, where that information came from. Can we trust the source of that information? Do you have multiple sources of the same information? Or could we pivot you a little bit to ask a better research question for right now that ultimately will help you get the answer to the question that you're asking? Question number 3 is you need to make sure that you're being really specific about what it is you want to know. So after you've done that exercise about how do I know it, this is the point at which some of you have to pivot that spotlight question and focus on something else in order to answer some of those ancillary questions that ultimately will lead you back to the original question that you had. So what do I want to know? Of course, I want to know grandma's maiden name. But I just realized that the marriage information I had for her, I actually just heard that, wrote it down from my mom. I don't actually have a marriage certificate. I do know when her children were born. I do know that those early censuses have an approximate year of marriage, but I don't know that they were married in the time and place that I thought they were married, and I don't have an actual marriage record. And that actual marriage record, guess what's going to be on it? Her maiden name. Or maybe the name of her first husband. Okay, so sometimes we have to pivot a little bit and get really clear about what it is that we want to know. And then, and this is kind of these 4 questions are the magic formula to all brick walls. Where could you find that information? Yes, I'm looking for great grandma's maiden name, but great grandma's maiden name would appear on her marriage record, unless it was a subsequent marriage. It would probably appear on the death certificates of her children, or in their obituaries, or maybe on some of their marriage records. It might appear in the household of people living with her when her, sibling is living with them, or an aunt is living with them. That might be a clue. So where are other places you could find that information? Especially when we're new, it's really easy to just say, oh, I can't find a birth certificate for great grandma. But that's because we don't know that birth certificates actually didn't exist back then in some of those places. So where else could you find that information? So that's the next step. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can hit pause and actually go through this exercise before you move on. I think that would be really useful. If you're here with me live on a Wednesday, it's a little trickier to push pause when I'm live, but I hope that you'll come back and go through this exercise. I want you to make a list of all of the places that you think you could possibly find that information. And then be willing to ask for help. Again, in the comments on YouTube, here in the chat, wherever it is that you're in a Facebook group or in part of a genealogy community, if you're a member of a genealogical society or you attend a genealogy conference, come find me. I would love to walk through this exercise with you and have you actually get really specific and label out exactly what you know, how you know it, what you really want to know, and where you could find that information. And I could brainstorm ideas with you all day long about the places you could find the information that you're really looking for. So this, if you're going to take a screenshot of anything that we're talking about today, this is it. Or if you've written down these questions so that you have them available to you, this is the core and the heart of breaking through brick walls, is being able to ask yourself these questions and then to answer them. Okay? Okay, let's move on. I'm going to give you a couple of other strategies. All of them are really based around those core 4 questions, but these strategies are just designed to help your brain start working in a little bit different way, to help give you information to fill in those gaps of what you don't know that you don't know. So here is the first strategy that I have for you, which is if you're feeling stuck, just back up a generation. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but I want to do a deep dive on this because this really, sometimes when you're stuck, you have to go backward in order to go forward. I have a brick wall at a 3 times great-grandfather. His name is George Cowan. He was born in about 1790 in Ireland. Every record we have says Ireland, but if you know anything about Irish research, you know that's not good enough. You have to know where in Ireland they came from, at least the county, if not the specific town or village, or you won't get anywhere in researching that particular family. And everything that we had from him just said Ireland. Now, this was one of those families from my Aunt Madeline that as we were climbing the family tree, I thought, oh, they only have one child. And he and Jane lived in Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia, and they never moved. The state boundaries, Virginia, the state boundaries moved around them. They did move a little bit through a couple of different communities, but really all just within that little 8-mile sliver of the part of West Virginia that sticks up there in between Ohio and Pennsylvania. And so I knew where they were. I knew who my ancestor was, that, my 2 times great-grandfather. Just kept getting stuck. I kept looking for records about George, couldn't find anything else. So I thought, let me come back down a generation. So I came back down a generation, and what I quickly discovered as I started looking into who else my 2 times great-grandfather was associated with was that he was not an only child. He had a brother who was a U.S. senator. He had 2 other brothers who were doctors. And ultimately, the family had 13 children. And so I started researching the lives of every one of those 13 children. And I did it for years. And I found some really cool stories and some amazing information about my 2 times great-grandfather and about my 3 times great-grandparents. But still, every single record I found just listed George's birthplace as Ireland. So then I thought, what if I came back down another generation? So I dropped down to the level of George's grandchildren. Now, with 13 children, the number of grandchildren in that family was ridiculous. I managed to trace, I think, almost every single one of them. A lot of them stayed in Ohio. A large group of them, including my 2 times great-grandparents, went to Ashland, Ohio. Some of them stayed up in Steubenville and in the Pittsburgh area. And then a group of them, a couple of the brothers, moved to Iowa. And they were living in Iowa and raising their families there. And I have all these grandchildren now in Iowa. And I come across this book, and it's a local town history written in, I think it was 1976. And the reason that's important is because in 1876, at the 100th anniversary of the United States of America, the federal government asked all the little towns and communities across the country to write a biographical history of their town. What were the first churches, the first schools, who were the first settlers, who were the prominent people in the community? Write a history of your community and then give a copy of that history to the Library of Congress. And there were a bunch of communities that did that. So if you ever come across town and local histories, and Ancestry has thousands of them on our website, you'll see these little histories. Well, that was in 1876. Some communities took a little longer to get theirs done. And so some were published in like the early 1900s. But then in 1976, at the 200th anniversary of the country, there was another call out that went out to communities who either hadn't done it the first time around or wanted to update those books. And so I found this book published in 1976 that was an update of one of the books written in 1876. And in the back of the book were biographical sketches of prominent people in the community. And one of the prominent people in that community was one of George's grandchildren. And in his biographical sketch, it stated that his paternal grandfather had come from County Down, Ireland. That is, to this date, the only scrap of information I have found that denotes a specific county. But with that information, I was able to then go look up the Cowans of County Down, and there's a whole book published about them. But because I knew where to look, now I have more sources of information to continue to trace George and his family back. So when you get stuck trying to progress in your family tree, try coming down a generation or two and see what else you can learn. Who else in the family might have the information that you need? Okay. A couple of things to think about, okay? Look at the whole family. It's really tempting to say, oh, I found a brother, his death certificate lists mom's maiden name, I'm going to move on. But what if his death certificate's wrong? When you have the death certificates of 13 children, and several of them list the same mother's maiden name, and then one lists some wackadoodle name, you know, to resolve that conflicting evidence, you can start to put the pieces together a little bit easier. So I recommend always looking at the whole family. In addition to making sure you're going to have more accurate information and be able to continue to progress in your family tree, it's also just kind of more fun. You get the full family story. I don't know about you, but my life is about a whole lot more than just me and my parents. It involves my siblings and my aunts and uncles and my cousins and my nibblings. And like, it is like my family story cannot be told without all of us. And our ancestors were no different. So look at the whole family. Collect all the records for each person. Don't just stop at, oh, I found their death certificate, or oh, find them in every census. Find them in birth, marriage, and death records. Look for newspaper articles. What military records exist? Any records you can find, not just to round out the story of them as a person or their family unit, but also to add to that larger family narrative and to make sure you have as many data points as possible to get accurate information. One of those paper brick wall situations that we create for ourselves is that sometimes we create what I call Franken people, right? Those are people in our tree who aren't actually real because we've got a conglomeration of information from lots of different people, or we've put in a couple of pieces of false information. And a person's identity is really about the events that happened in their lives, the relationships that they had, the choices that they made. That's what makes up a person's identity. And so if you've got some of that information wrong, or a mishmash of information from several real people that you've made into one Franken person, you're never going to be able to keep moving because this isn't a real person. That's not their real identity. So that's the point, is we're going to collect all the records to make sure we've identified people correctly so that we can keep making new discoveries. Always look for missing pieces of information, right, in those sibling records. Make sure you extract all the juicy goodness from those records. And then never assume that one record tells the whole story. Always look for all the records. Have I made that point enough? I think that's important. And it's a thing that a lot of new people don't understand. So I just want to make sure if you're new that you understand that. And if you're more experienced, maybe you get that conceptually, but I'm going to belabor the point because I think sometimes we get so excited when we find a piece of information that we don't go to the effort of making sure we have all the information in order to make sure that evidence is accurate. Okay, next strategy. Your next strategy is to create a timeline. Now, when you've got a really specific research question and you've gone through the steps of what you know and how you know it, and is that really what you want to know, and where could you find the information, one of the things is that sometimes all the things you know, or even the few things you know, feel like a little bit of a mishmash of information in your brain or in your paperwork. I don't know if any of you have had to tame the genealogy paper monster. I've finally managed to do it. I've gone almost entirely digital. But that still means sometimes I end up with notes in my computer and in my tree that are all over the place. So one of the strategies to kind of just put all of that into an order that makes sense and that will help you move forward is to create a timeline. Timelines allow you to see the gaps, to see what else you're missing really clearly. And they also allow you to spot the patterns. Here's what that looks like in practicality, okay? You can start to see things like migration patterns. So when you put together a timeline, that timeline is not just a list of dates. It also needs to include a list of places. So she got married on this date, but I don't know the place. She had her first child on this date, and I do know the place. And then she had 9 other children, and here's the dates and places where those events occurred. And then I'm going to slot in to that timeline where she's living on any given census. And so now I've built this timeline and I can start to see, where are my gaps? Oh, I'm missing that marriage location. What are the patterns? Oh, well, they were living in Carroll County, Arkansas, and Carroll County, Arkansas, and Carroll County, Arkansas, and then Stone County, Missouri. What is happening? And Stone County, Missouri, and then back to Carroll County, Arkansas. And you can start to look for those kinds of patterns. And then you can look up locations and realize, oh, Carroll County, Arkansas, and Stone County, Missouri are right next to each other. It's just across an imaginary state line on a map. And so really, maybe they didn't move. Maybe they just, maybe they lived in the same place, but they had an event that occurred in this place. Or maybe they did move for some reason, but they were moving to neighboring farmland. Or like, you can start to look for those patterns and that information and see what that reveals. So migration or immigration patterns. It also shows you what missing records to look for. That marriage record, because I don't know where they got married, which means even though she says she was born in Tennessee, all her records are in Arkansas. Maybe she didn't get married in Arkansas. Maybe she got married in Tennessee. Or maybe she got married in Missouri because they went from Tennessee over to Missouri and then down to Arkansas. So you start to look at those timelines of dates and locations to look for migration patterns, missing records, and then inconsistencies. Inconsistencies are going to show up when you timeline a bunch of information. Those inconsistencies are going to be things like, why is it that I have a child born in Carroll County, Arkansas, and a child born in Carroll County, Arkansas, and a child born in Stone County, Missouri, and then a child born in Bakersfield, California? And then a child born in Carroll County, Arkansas. Did they actually go to California? Or is that maybe not one of their children and I've grabbed the wrong information? Or is that their child, but I don't have the right birth date and location for them because I mixed them up with somebody else who had the same name and a mom with the same first name? So timelining out information helps you start to spot those kinds of inconsistencies in your family tree and where you might have taken a left turn somewhere that you shouldn't have. Okay, so inconsistencies that need explaining. Then what I want you to do is in that historical timeline, start to leaf in that personal timeline, start to leaf in historical context. So for example, was there a world war in the middle of that? That big old gap where she wasn't having any kids, I might not be missing a child. Her husband might have been off at war. And so that is explainable. When they moved from one county to another, maybe it's because there was some unrest in that particular location. Or maybe they were renting their farmland and they never owned their own property. And so they had to be kind of migrants around to different rental properties to continue to farm and support their family. So look at historical context and see where you can leaf that into the timeline. Ultimately, not only is that going to give you a more interesting story about that person in their life, but it's going to help you start to think about where else could I find records that are going to help me answer the question that I want to answer. Okay. Okay. We're getting down to the last few minutes. I do have, I think, one more strategy for you here, and that is to think like a genealogist. If you're brand new to family history, you may have just come into this because you were curious or you wanted to answer a specific question, or you took a DNA test and you wanted to see what it was all about, or like there are a million reasons people come into family history. But now that you're here, I think it's really fun to start to think like a genealogist and research like a pro. Methodology matters, and there's lots of different methodologies that you can apply. So just find the one that works for you. For me, I created my own methodology, the search party method, because I needed a framework that worked for my brain. I created this list of 4 questions that you can use as a framework to do this. There's lots of different kinds of methodologies. Some of them are search strategies. Some of them are research strategies, but start to just educate yourself. And the fact that you're here means you're doing it, about how genealogists think and how we look at records. So how do you do that? Here are just a couple of things. I once had an old man in a conference that I was speaking at in the front row who raised his hand and he said, Crista, I heard once that you only need 3 records in order to prove a fact in your family tree. And is that true? How many records do I need? And my answer to him was, you need all of them. You need all the records. And hopefully I've belabored that point enough today that you get why that's important, not just that I am trying to get you to gather more information, but because in the gathering of more information, you start to see all the evidence and how it stacks up against each other. You start to be able to recognize the inconsistencies and you start to be able to come closer to the truth. You need all the records. Now, sometimes all the records means you've got a census for every 10 years that lists all the details. You've got birth, marriage, and death records for all the children. You've got newspaper articles and military pension files. And I mean, sometimes all the records is amazing, an amazing amount of information. Sometimes all the records, after all that work, is one little line in an Iowa town history biography that his grandfather, George Cowan, came from County Down, Ireland. But I wouldn't have gotten to that record, that one record, if I hadn't done all the other work. So you need all the records. Now, this is something that I recommend. It's something that I do. If this overwhelms you, you don't have to do this right now, but I will show you what it looks like in my tree. I transcribe every record I find. And I do that, like I mentioned earlier, because I want to wring out all the juicy goodness, because I don't want to be like that woman who came to me looking for her great-grandfather in a passenger or to know when he immigrated. and to know she was sitting on that information the whole time it was in the census record. But she didn't know because she didn't take the time to understand what every little bit of information on every column of that line of the census record meant. The date was sitting right there the whole time, but she didn't wring all the juicy goodness out of that record. So the way I do this is by transcribing the records. So let me pull up my tree here and show you exactly what that looks like if this is a methodology that you want to employ for yourself. Okay, so on Ancestry, we are going to go to my tree. And we are going to take a look at my great-grandfather, Frederick. There's my Aunt Madeline, bless her heart. Okay, so here is Frederick. And every person in your ancestry tree, you can add notes. And these are what my notes look like. So for example, I found him in the 1900 census. Let me make this a little larger so you can read and follow along. I found him in the 1900 census, and I have transcribed all of the information from that record into his notes. I have an index to his 1917 marriage record to my Grandma Cowan. I have a newspaper article that announces their marriage, and I transcribed all of the text of that. I found him in a city directory. I have a notation in the timeline because I was creating a timeline that he retired from the Army. I actually have his discharge papers attached. I probably should transcribe those. I found him in the 1930 census, and there he is in the 1940 census. And then I have some duplicate information I'm trying to weave in. So that's what record transcription looks like for me. And I do that, and in transcribing those records, not only am I wringing all the juicy goodness out of them, but I'm also building a timeline of his life. So I don't have to go back and do that later when I get stuck somewhere about something. So that is one of the things that most professional genealogists do is they transcribe records. And I find that transcribing them, oh, I just shared the same screen again. I find that transcribing them directly into the notes on my tree is the fastest, easiest way to do it. And it keeps all the information together without me having to have lots of notebooks and Google Docs and whatever else. Okay. In addition to transcribing all the records, one of the things that I record in those notes is what I didn't find. So for example, I have an ancestor who I have been looking for in the census for a long time. I have one census that I'm missing. And I've done all the searches and I can't find him. So in that notes, I just put this census year, I have done these searches. I've looked for them with this spelling and this spelling and this spelling. And then I also went through this town page by page and read every page of the census, looking to see if I could find them, because I thought that might be where they were living and I didn't find them. So one of the things that pros do is we record what we don't find. And the reason is because then that stops us from doing the same searches over and over and over again, because we know we've already searched these specific things in these specific places. And then start to develop a habit of thinking beyond the obvious. It's really easy to think, oh, I just need a birth certificate and that will magically answer all my questions. One of the primary differences between someone who is a beginner or a novice genealogist and a professional genealogist is when we're new, we tend to think if I can just find the record that answers my question, then I can move on. And when we're a little bit more experienced, we realize that there usually, especially the further back in time you go, is not a single record that will ever answer your question. It's a gathering of evidence and then putting that evidence together in a way that makes sense and proves the question that we're trying to answer. So just thinking about records and information differently, and thinking beyond the obvious. If there's not a birth certificate, what other records might contain birth information about this person. So those are the kinds of things. And then, and we'll just wrap up with this. One of the methodologies that most professional genealogists use is what we call fan club research, or what Ancestry now calls Ancestry networks. So if you have Ancestry Pro Tools, you currently have access to the beta version of networks, and networks allow you to research the other people in your ancestor's life. So if I'm looking for great grandma's maiden name, and I've already researched all her kids, and I've looked for her marriage record, and I've done all the things, and I'm not having any success, I've repeatedly hit that brick wall over and over and over in the same spot, and that wall is not really paper, and it's not tumbling down. Maybe what I need to start doing is researching all of the neighbors on the census, particularly that one neighbor who, when they were living in Carroll County, Missouri, and living in Stone County, or Carroll County, Arkansas, and Stone County, Missouri, both showed up as a neighbor. Why were they migrating together? Maybe it's because that neighbor is her brother-in-law. But I have to start collecting that information in order to come to that conclusion. Why did she become a founding member of that particular Baptist church with those 4 other people? What was their relationship? Are they family? Are those cousins? Is one of them her sister? Because those women are going to have different last names after they get married. So Ancestry Networks gives you a place to start collecting all of that information about those other people and the other records about them, so that you can come to some of those conclusions. If you haven't already watched the video I did about Ancestry Networks, you can find it at ancestry.com/education. That's the same place you can register for these free Wednesday virtual events. And you can find the replays on the page below that. So if you're interested in how networks work, you can find the video replay of that there. Well, I hope this was a useful hour for you to go through this, thinking we all have genealogy brick walls. Every one of us, myself included. Some of mine are long-standing brick walls. Some of them, once I've applied some of these principles, I've just busted right through like they were paper. Some of them required a little bit of focused attention, and they really were a brick wall that eventually came tumbling down. But we all have them, and we all have them because we don't know what we don't know, because we're learning new skills, because we're here working, trying to figure out who our family was. And maybe it's because something in the ancestors wants us to learn more about their whole lives, not just keep climbing the family tree, chasing the next generation. So I hope that's been useful for you. Will you do me a favor before you go? Whether you're watching this live or whether you are watching on YouTube, will you just leave a comment in the chat or a comment on the YouTube video, helping me understand one new thing you learned today? That helps me know if I'm pacing these things correctly, if you're getting good information out of them. I also fully believe that if you have to type out what you learned, you're more likely to remember it. So if you would please, in the chat or the comments, just leave one new thing you learned today, and then go to ancestry.com/education. After we're done, you'll see our next 3 upcoming Ancestry Wednesday free virtual events, and you can register for those. They are free. You just need to register if you want to participate live so that we can send you the Zoom link. Otherwise, you're welcome to always look for these videos about a week later on the Ancestry YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.